"I'll give you my last dollar if you just touch my hand." A disgraced millionaire sat in a dark playground, desperate enough to pay a child for the one thing money had never bought him: human connection. What happened next shattered him completely and saved his life. This is a story about a man who lost everything: his empire, his family, his soul, and discovered that redemption doesn't come from wealth. It comes from a single touch that changes everything. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me, what city are you watching from right now? And if you believe in second chances and stories that transform hearts, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after it ends. Richard Harmon had once been the kind of man who made headlines. CEO of a pharmaceutical empire, his signature on contracts moved millions. His decisions shaped industries. His name commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. At 52, he'd stood at the pinnacle of American success. Penthouse in Manhattan, summer home in the Hamptons, a wife who graced magazine covers, twin daughters at Yale. That was 18 months ago. Now Richard sat on a bench in Washington Square Park, wearing a coat that had cost $3,000 but hadn't been cleaned in 4 months. His shoes, handmade Italian leather, were scuffed and splitting at the seams. His hair, once meticulously styled, hung limp and greasy against his collar. He looked like what he was: a man who'd fallen from a great height and shattered on impact. The fall had been spectacular. A whistleblower had exposed his company's practice of manipulating drug trial data, inflating prices on life-saving medications, prioritizing profit over patients. The investigation had been brutal. Federal charges, congressional hearings, his face on every news channel, labeled as everything from corporate villain to merchant of death. He'd claimed ignorance, said he hadn't known what his research division was doing. It was technically true. He'd deliberately not known, had insulated himself from uncomfortable details, had chosen profit margins over asking hard questions about how those margins were achieved. The courts hadn't been sympathetic. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, his assets frozen, then seized. His wife had left, taken the girls, changed their names to distance themselves from his disgrace. He couldn't blame them. He'd become toxic, pariah, the man who'd killed people through greed, because people had died. That was the part that haunted him in the long sleepless nights. Real people with names and families and futures. They died because medications were priced beyond reach, because trial data was falsified, because Richard Harmon had prioritized his empire over their lives. He'd lost everything: money, reputation, family, freedom. He'd served 14 months in minimum security before being released. But the losses that destroyed him weren't material. They were moral. The weight of knowing that his success had been built on suffering, that his empire had required human sacrifice, that he'd traded other people's lives for his comfort. Richard had been out of prison for 4 months now. No job prospects, who would hire him? No family, they'd made their choice. No friends, they'd evaporated when the money did. Just days bleeding into each other. A small room in a boarding house paid for by his court-appointed social worker, and the crushing weight of guilt that made breathing feel like an undeserved privilege. He had $11.37 to his name. His next disability check, he'd developed a heart condition in prison, wouldn't come for 3 more days. He'd already stretched these dollars beyond reason. A $1 slice of pizza could last 2 meals if he was careful. Coffee from the bodega, nursed for hours. Nothing wasted. Every cent calculated. But it wasn't enough. Not the money. The money had never been enough, even when he'd had billions. Now, with almost nothing, Richard understood something that terrified him. The emptiness inside wasn't from losing his wealth. It had always been there. The empire had just been elaborate camouflage for a hollow man. He sat on the bench watching people pass. Students from NYU, laughing and careless. Mothers pushing strollers. An old man feeding pigeons with gentle patience. People living their lives, connected to something Richard couldn't access. They had so little compared to what he'd once had. But they had something he'd never possessed. The simple, profound ability to exist without guilt crushing every breath. Richard's hands shook slightly. A tremor from the heart medication, or maybe just from being fundamentally broken. He looked at those hands. They'd signed contracts worth billions, shaken hands with presidents and CEOs. Now they shook from weakness and shame, useful for nothing except perhaps one last desperate transaction. Because Richard had made a decision. 3 days from now, when his check came, he would end this. Not dramatically, just quietly slip away, stop being a burden on a world he'd only ever harmed. He'd made his plans carefully, researched methods, written letters, apologies to the families of people who died because of his choices. Not that apologies meant anything, but at least he could name what he'd done, acknowledge the weight of it. But before he went, Richard wanted one thing. Something he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Something his money had never been able to buy, and his disgrace had made impossible to receive. He wanted to be touched by another human being. Not sexually, not transactionally, just touched. A hand on his shoulder, a palm pressed against his own. Some physical acknowledgement that he existed, that he was human despite what he'd done, that he wasn't completely untouchable. His wife had stopped touching him years before the scandal. Their marriage had been dead long before it was buried. His daughters had flinched from his hugs even when they were small, sensing something cold in him. In prison, touch meant violence or dominance. Since release, he'd been invisible. People stepped around him on sidewalks. Clerks handed him change without contact. He was a ghost moving through the world, present but unacknowledged. Richard knew it was pathetic. This desperate hunger for human touch, for some physical reminder that he was still a person worthy of basic human connection. But pathetic or not, it consumed him. He would pay for it. His last dollar. Everything he had left. For just one moment of genuine human contact before he left this world he'd only ever poisoned. The afternoon light was fading. Richard stood slowly. His heart condition made movement difficult and began walking, looking, searching for someone who might accept his last dollar in exchange for the simplest human gesture. Someone desperate enough to overlook who he was, what he'd done. Someone who might touch the hand of a monster for money. Richard walked through the park as evening descended, studying faces. He needed to find someone before darkness fell completely, before he lost his nerve, before the absurdity of what he was attempting overwhelmed him. A young couple sat on the grass, wrapped around each other, lost in their private world. No, they had their own connection. They didn't need his desperate transaction. A homeless man slumped against a tree, cardboard sign propped beside him. Hungry. Anything helps. Richard's hand moved toward his pocket, then stopped. That man had more dignity than Richard did. More honest need. Richard's hunger wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be satisfied with food or shelter. A group of teenagers laughed and shoved each other playfully, the casual physical contact of young people who'd never known true isolation. Richard watched them with something close to grief. He'd been like that once, hadn't he? Before ambition had calcified him. Before success had taught him that connection was weakness, vulnerability was liability. Emotions were inefficiencies to be managed. He kept walking, his breathing labored. The heart condition made everything harder, walking, thinking, simply existing. Another consequence of his choices. The stress of the trial, the guilt, the loss. It had quite literally broken his heart. The irony wasn't lost on him. Near the fountain, a street performer was packing up. A violinist who'd been playing for tips. She looked exhausted, counting crumpled bills with fingers roughened from strings. Richard approached hesitantly. "Excuse me." She looked up, and he saw the moment she recognized him. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to disgust so quickly it was like watching a door slam. "I know who you are. Get away from me. My mother died because she couldn't afford her insulin. Your company made it, priced it beyond reach. So no, whatever you want, the answer is no." She grabbed her violin case and walked away quickly, almost running, as if his presence might contaminate her. Richard stood frozen, her words echoing in his skull. Her mother, because of insulin pricing, because of his company's decisions. Decisions he'd approved, or at least hadn't questioned hard enough. He made himself keep walking. Each step was harder. His chest ached. The heart condition or guilt he couldn't distinguish anymore. They felt the same. Both ways his body was breaking under the weight of what he'd done. The park was emptying as darkness settled. The performers and vendors were gone. The families had headed home. Only the fixtures of nighttime remained. Homeless people finding sleeping spots, drug dealers conducting quiet business, a few determined joggers making final loops. Richard found himself at the children's playground, now empty, swings moving slightly in the evening breeze. He sat on a bench, breathing hard, feeling the edges of panic. This was impossible. Stupid. Who would accept money to touch him? Who would want to? He was untouchable in every sense. Morally contaminated. A man whose touch might transfer his guilt like a disease. Maybe that was the point. Maybe he deserved this isolation. Maybe the inability to receive human touch was fitting punishment for a man who'd touched so many lives with harm. Cosmic justice. Spiritual quarantine. Mister? You okay? Richard looked up, startled. A boy stood a few feet away, maybe 10 years old, skinny, wearing clothes that had seen too many washes. His face was wary but not unkind. The kind of kid who'd learned to read situations quickly, assess threats, stay aware. Richard's voice cracked. I'm fine. Thank you. You don't look fine. You look sick. The boy moved closer, studying him with unsettling directness. You having a heart attack or something? Should I call 911? No, I'm all right. Just tired. You're that guy, the boy said suddenly. From the news. The medicine guy. The one who went to jail. Richard's stomach dropped. Yes, that's me. He waited for the boy to run, to curse him, to spit at his feet. Waited for the condemnation a child could deliver more purely than any adult. But the boy just studied him. My dad said you were evil. Said people like you are why the world's messed up. Why poor people can't get help when they're sick. Your father's right. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. But you don't look evil. You look sad. Really, really sad. The boy tilted his head. Why are you here? In the park? Don't you have like a mansion or something? I lost everything. Prison. Lawsuits. I have nothing left. Good, the boy said simply. You deserved that. People died because of you. I know. Richard felt tears start. Shameful, useless tears. I know they did. I think about them every day. Every person who died because they couldn't afford medicine my company made. Every family destroyed. I know what I did. I know what I am. The boy was quiet for a long moment. So why are you telling me? Why are you crying to some kid in the park? Because... Richard drew a shaking breath. 'Cause I need to ask you something. And I know it's strange. Wrong, maybe. But I'm desperate. And I'm out of options. And you're the only person who's talked to me in weeks without immediate hatred. What do you want? Suspicious now. Protective. Ready to run. I want to give you my last $. $11, actually. Everything I have. Richard pulled the crumpled bills from his pocket with shaking hands. And in exchange, I want you to touch my hand. Just for a moment. That's all. Just touch my hand. So I can remember what human contact feels like before I... He stopped. Couldn't say it. Before I leave. The boy stared at him. That's weird, mister. Really weird. I know. I'm sorry. Forget I asked. Keep the money anyway. You probably need it more than... Why would you pay me to touch you? That doesn't make sense. Richard tried to explain, words tumbling out in desperate confession. About isolation. About being untouchable. About losing everything including the simple human experience of physical connection. About wanting, just once before the end, to know if he was still human enough to receive kindness, or if he'd forfeited that right along with everything else. The boy listened to Richard's broken explanation without interrupting. His young face was serious, considering, weighing something Richard couldn't see. When Richard finally fell silent, they sat in that heavy quiet that follows confession. That's the saddest thing I ever heard, the boy said finally. And that's saying something, because I've heard a lot of sad things. Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Another useless gesture. I shouldn't have asked. I'm sorry. Please just take the money. You don't owe me anything. I'm not taking your last dollars. That's stupid. The boy's voice was firm. If those are your last dollars, you need them for food. For survival. Not for whatever this is. I don't want to survive. The words came out before Richard could stop them. Honest. I'm tired of surviving. I'm tired of breathing air I don't deserve to breathe. I'm tired of taking up space in a world I only ever damaged. 3 days from now I'll get a check. After that I'm done. So these dollars, they're truly my last. They're useless to me. But maybe one person, just one person, could look past what I am for 30 seconds. Could give me one moment of human touch. Even if I have to buy it. Even if it's not real. Just something. Before I go. The boy's eyes widened. You're talking about killing yourself. I'm talking about stopping. There's a difference. There's really not. The boy stood up, agitated now. Look, mister. I don't know what you think touching your hand is going to do. I don't know what you think $11 buys. But it's not going to fix whatever's broken in you. It's not going to undo what you did. And it's definitely not a good reason to stick around. I know that. Richard's voice was flat. I'm not looking for redemption. I'm not delusional enough to think one human touch will wash away the blood on my hands. I want to remember, for one moment, what it felt like to be connected to another person. To be seen as human, not as a monster. That's all. One moment. Then I'll go, and you can forget you ever met me. I'm not touching you for money. The boy's voice was sharp. That's gross. That's like prostitution or something. And I'm 10. I didn't mean. Richard felt his face flush with shame. I wasn't trying to make it transactional like that. I just thought if I offered something, anything, it might be less pathetic than just begging a stranger to touch me. It's more pathetic. Way more pathetic. The boy crossed his arms. You think money fixes everything. Even now, with nothing, you're trying to buy what you need instead of just asking like a person. The observation hit Richard like a physical blow. The boy was right. Even in absolute destitution, even having lost everything, Richard was still operating from the same broken logic that had destroyed his life. Everything is a transaction. Everything can be bought. Value equals price. Human connection is just another acquisition. You're right, Richard whispered. You're completely right. I don't know how else to be. I don't know how to ask for things without offering payment. I don't know how to receive without owing. The only way I've ever connected with people is through transactions, contracts, deals, exchanges. I never learned the other way, the free way, the way that's just human. That's messed up. Yes, it is. They sat in silence again. The playground equipment created gentle metallic sounds as the breeze pushed the swings. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. The city's nighttime symphony beginning. What's your name? The boy asked. Richard. Richard Harmon. I'm Carlos. The boy studied him. Richard, do you actually think you're beyond forgiveness? Like permanently? Forever? I don't believe in forgiveness. Not for what I did. How do you forgive causing deaths? How do you forgive choosing profit over people's lives? You can't. It's not forgivable. It's just what I am, what I did. And I have to live with that until I don't. That's convenient, Carlos said, surprising him. Deciding you're unforgivable means you don't have to do the hard work of actually changing. You just get to wallow and feel sorry for yourself and then check out. That's lazy. Richard stared at him. This 10-year-old child, delivering truth with devastating simplicity. I mean, you did terrible things, Carlos continued. Really terrible. My dad's friend died because he couldn't afford his heart medicine. Your company made it. So yeah, you're responsible for real damage. But saying you're beyond forgiveness? That's just giving up. That's taking the easy way out instead of spending the rest of your life trying to fix even a tiny bit of what you broke. I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do. I have no money, no power, no way to make amends. Because making amends requires money? Carlos challenged. Because the only way to help people is from the top of a corporation? That's the same broken thinking that got you here. Maybe the way you fix things is smaller, harder, more human. Richard felt something crack inside him. Not breaking, but opening. What do you mean? I mean, maybe you spend the rest of your life volunteering at free clinics, or advocating for medicine access, or telling your story so other CEOs don't make your mistakes, or just being there for people who are suffering because of systems you helped create. There's always something you can do, unless you're too proud, unless you'd rather die than live as a person with no power. The words landed like physical blows, because Carlos was right. Richard had been so focused on the impossibility of redemption from his former position of power that he'd never considered what redemption might look like from the bottom. He'd been so certain that matching required empire that he couldn't imagine matching in small ways. Daily ways. Human ways. I don't know how to do that, Richard admitted. I don't know how to be powerless and useful. I don't know how to matter without money. Then learn. Carlos stood up. Figure it out. Because killing yourself because you can't fix everything immediately is selfish. It lets you off the hook. It means the families of people who died never get your apology face to face. Never get to see you actually doing the work of trying to be better. You just get to escape. And they get nothing. Richard felt tears streaming down his face now. Not gentle tears. Harsh, painful tears that came from somewhere deep and previously untouched. Because Carlos was right. His planned suicide wasn't noble. It wasn't taking responsibility. It was the ultimate escape. The final transaction where he paid with his life to avoid the harder work of living with what he'd done. I'm scared, Richard whispered. I'm so scared of living like this. Powerless. Broke. Guilty. Alone. Every breath feels like I'm stealing air from people who deserve it more. Every day is carrying weight I don't know how to hold. Yeah, Carlos said simply. That's what life feels like for most people. Welcome to it. Carlos sat back down on the bench, this time leaving a little more space between them. Not out of fear, but out of intention. He wasn't guarding himself anymore. He was observing. Studying Richard the way someone studies a broken machine, trying to understand which part failed first. Up close, Richard didn't look dangerous. He looked small, folded in on himself. A man who had spent a lifetime towering over others and now didn't know how to exist without that height. You really don't get it, Carlos said after a long silence. His voice wasn't cruel, just blunt, honest in a way that didn't soften edges. Rich people, man. Even when you lose everything, you still think everything's about you. Richard flinched as if struck. What do you mean? He asked quietly. You're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself. Wanting someone to touch your hand so you can feel human before you die, Carlos continued. Like that's the big tragedy. But you know what? I touch people all the time. My mom, my friends, sometimes random people at the shelter where we live. And it doesn't fix anything. Richard looked up, confused. Touch doesn't magic away problems, Carlos said. It's just touch, connection, the thing you're supposed to do because you're human. Not because you want something from it. The word shelter hit Richard like a physical blow. You live in a shelter? He asked. Yeah, me and my mom. 2 years now. Since my dad died. Carlos said it the way people say facts they've repeated too many times for them to hurt the same way anymore. Cancer. Blood cancer. He got sick. Real fast. Richard's stomach tightened. He couldn't afford the good treatment, Carlos went on. There was a newer drug, way better odds, but it cost thousands per dose. Insurance wouldn't cover it. We couldn't pay, so he got the old treatment, the cheap one, the one that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And it didn't, Richard whispered. Carlos shook his head. No, it didn't. A silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. What was the drug? Richard asked, already afraid of the answer. Carlos shrugged. Some long name. Started with an L. Lenali. Something. Richard felt the world tilt. Lenalidomide. He knew it intimately. Quarterly reports. Profit curves. Patent extensions. price increases justified by market tolerance and shareholder responsibility. He'd approved those numbers himself. Signed off without hesitation. That was my company, Richard said, his voice barely audible. We made that drug. Carlos froze. I approved the pricing strategy, Richard continued, words spilling out now unstoppable. We raised the price, over and over, because we could. The air between them became toxic. My dad's drug, Carlos said flatly. Yes. They sat in unbearable silence. Richard hadn't just failed abstract strangers. He was sitting next to the consequence of his decisions. A living, breathing reminder of every signature he'd treated like ink instead of blood. I'm sorry, Richard said finally. The words felt obscene, insultingly small. I know that doesn't mean anything, but I'm sorry. You didn't even know him, Carlos said, his voice tight. That's the worst part. You didn't hate him. You didn't decide he deserved to die. You just never saw him. He wasn't real to you, just a statistic. Collateral damage. Yes, Richard said. That's exactly what I did. Carlos stood abruptly, pacing now, hands clenched. I should hate you. I should tell you to go through with whatever plan brought you here. Tell you the world's better without you. You'd be right, Richard said. I know I'd be right. Carlos snapped. Do you have any idea what it was like? Watching my dad get weaker every week? Knowing there was something that could help him but we couldn't afford it? Watching my mom cry herself to sleep because she couldn't save him? Richard didn't move. Didn't interrupt. You sat in some glass tower deciding profit margins while my dad was dying, Carlos continued. Families like mine were being destroyed, and you never had to see it. You never had to feel it. You just made money. Carlos's voice broke. He wiped his face angrily. And now you're here crying because you lost your money. Boo-hoo. You know what my dad would have traded everything for? To live. But he didn't get that choice. You took it from him. Richard felt every word land exactly where it belonged. You're right, he said. All of it. Carlos stopped pacing. I didn't come here looking for redemption, Richard continued. I came here thinking everything could be solved with a transaction, because that's all I ever understood. But you're showing me something else. That connection isn't something you buy. It's something you give. And I stole that from people. From your father. Carlos turned back, tears streaking his face. I don't want to forgive you, he said. Maybe I never will. I don't expect you to. But I also don't want you to die, Carlos said. Not because you deserve mercy, but because dying is easy. Living with what you did, facing it every day, trying to do better, that's hard. And maybe that's what you owe. Something shifted inside Richard. Not peace, not forgiveness, but the smallest fracture in certainty. I don't know how to do that, Richard said. Carlos met his eyes. Figure it out. You're supposed to be smart, right? Use that brain to learn how to live as someone trying to make amends instead of dying as a coward. The words stayed with Richard long after the bench went quiet. They remained seated in the darkened playground, the silence between them no longer hostile, but heavy. Dense with everything that had been said and everything that still hurt too much to put into words. The swings creaked softly in the night breeze, an almost forgotten sound of childhood joy that now felt painfully distant. Carlos had stopped crying, but his face was still blotchy, raw, marked by grief that had never truly healed. Richard, meanwhile, felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been dug out of his chest and left him exposed, empty, and trembling. Can I ask you something? Richard finally said, his voice barely louder than the wind. And you can tell me to shut up if it's too much. Carlos hesitated, then nodded, cautious but listening. What was your father like? Richard asked. As a person. Carlos frowned slightly. Why do you want to know? Because you're right, Richard said quietly. I never saw him. I never imagined him. He was just a number on a spreadsheet, a distant consequence of a decision I approved without thinking. But he existed. He mattered. And if I'm going to carry the weight of what I did, Then I need to know who I took from the world. Carlos stared at the ground for a long time before speaking. He was funny, he said at last. Like, really goofy. The kind of funny that made Mom roll her eyes but made me laugh every time. He told awful jokes and laughed at them before anyone else could. He worked construction. Hard, exhausting work. But no matter how tired he was, he always found energy for me. Richard listened intently, afraid to interrupt. He built me a treehouse once, Carlos continued. We didn't even have a tree. He just built it on wooden stilts in our tiny backyard. Said rules were flexible if you were creative enough. Richard felt each word land like a quiet blow. He sang in the shower, Carlos said, a faint smile breaking through the pain. Terribly. Mom said he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. He loved baseball. Yankees fan. I liked the Mets just to annoy him. We'd argue about it like it was life or death. And Mom would laugh at us both. Carlos swallowed hard. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to tie my shoes, how to shake someone's hand firm but not too hard. Said respect mattered. When he got sick, Carlos went on, his voice trembling. He tried to hide it, didn't want to scare us. But I noticed. He got thinner, tired all the time. Then one day he collapsed at work. That's when everything changed. I'm so sorry, Richard whispered, knowing the words were useless. He fought, Carlos said. Did everything the doctors told him. Never complained, even when the treatments made him so sick he couldn't stand. Mom and I stayed with him, read to him, just sat there. And he tried to smile for us. Tried to be strong. But I could see it, he was scared. Scared of dying. Scared of leaving us alone. Did he know about the drug? Richard asked softly. The one that might have helped? Carlos nodded. Yeah, the doctor mentioned it. Better odds. But when we saw the price, he shook his head. We tried everything. Fundraisers, family, friends. Nothing was enough. It was never meant for people like us. People like me made it that way, Richard said, barely audible. Yes, Carlos replied. People like you. Richard felt his chest tighten. He mattered, he said firmly. His life mattered. And what happened to him should never have happened. But it did, Carlos said. And the world just kept going. I don't know how to fix that, Richard admitted. But maybe I can make sure fewer people disappear like he did. Carlos studied him carefully. Words are easy. I know, Richard said. That's why I have to stay. Staying is the hard part. They sat together in silence, the weight of loss and responsibility settling between them. The night felt different now, not lighter, but honest. Finally, Carlos stood and held out his hand. Not for money, he said. Not for pity. Just because you're human. Richard stared at the small hand in front of him, his hands shaking as he reached out. When their palms met, warmth spread through him. Not relief, not forgiveness, but something fragile and real. And in that moment, something inside Richard finally broke. Not into despair, but into truth. Richard's hand met Carlos's, and the sensation overwhelmed him. Not because it was magical, not because sparks flew or the world changed in some dramatic way. It was simply skin on skin. Warmth meeting warmth. The most basic form of human contact. And yet, the weight of that moment, the meaning behind it, hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. Something inside him, frozen for years, cracked open. He began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears he'd shed earlier, but deep, uncontrollable sobs that tore their way out of his chest. Sounds he hadn't made since childhood. Grief he'd buried long before the scandal, before the empire, before he'd convinced himself that success required emotional armor. He had spent decades training himself not to feel, not to connect, not to be vulnerable. And now all of it came rushing back at once. Carlos didn't pull away. The 10-year-old held Richard's hand firmly, steady and grounded, offering presence rather than comfort, strength rather than pity. A child anchoring a grown man as he fell apart. Not judging him, not excusing him, just staying, just being there. The very thing Richard had tried to buy earlier, now given freely without transaction or condition. "I'm sorry," Richard gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry. For your father. For everyone. For everything I did. I'm so sorry." "I know," Carlos said softly. "I hear you. I know it doesn't fix anything," Richard continued, voice breaking. "I know saying sorry doesn't bring anyone back." "No," Carlos replied. "But it's a start. And it's more than most people like you ever do." Richard couldn't stop crying. Years of suppressed grief poured out, for the lives his decisions had ended, for the families destroyed, for the man he had chosen to become, and for the emptiness he'd created by valuing profit over people. The dam had finally broken. Carlos stayed with him through it all, not rushing him, not trying to stop the tears, just bearing witness, just present. The way Richard imagined Carlos's father must have been. Steady, patient, loving. Eventually, the sobs slowed. Richard wiped his face with his free hand, embarrassed but strangely lighter. Something essential had been released. A pressure he hadn't known how to name had finally eased. "Thank you," Richard whispered, "for not hating me enough to refuse." "I didn't say I don't hate you," Carlos corrected calmly. "I said I'd help you. That's different." He paused. "I probably do hate you, at least a little, for what happened to my dad. But I also believe people can change. My dad believed that. He said everyone deserves a chance to be better, even when they've done terrible things." "He sounds like he was a good man," Richard said. "Better than I ever was." "Yeah," Carlos nodded. "He was." Carlos finally released Richard's hand and sat back down. Richard flexed his fingers, still feeling the lingering warmth. He'd come to the park prepared to trade his last dollar for a moment of touch, and instead received something priceless. Connection without payment, grace without obligation. "I don't know how to thank you," Richard said. "Don't," Carlos replied. "Show me. Stay. Do the work. Don't quit when it gets uncomfortable. That's the only thanks that matters." "What if I fail?" Richard asked. "What if I try and it doesn't change anything?" "Then you fail," Carlos said plainly. "But at least you tried. At least you didn't take the easy way out." He looked at Richard with quiet intensity. "My dad fought cancer for 6 months knowing he'd probably lose. He fought anyway. If he could face that, you can face this." The words hit hard. They sat in silence afterward, the playground shadows stretching around them, the city humming faintly in the distance. Somewhere, people were living their lives, connected, loved, unseen. "When you were rich," Carlos asked eventually, "did you ever think about people like us? Or were we invisible?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Invisible. Completely. I saw numbers, charts, profits, but never faces, never families. I didn't decide you didn't matter. I just never allowed myself to see you." "That's honest," Carlos said. "Even if it's ugly." "It is." "So what changed?" "Losing everything," Richard answered. "Power insulates you. Wealth protects you from consequences. When it's gone, you finally see who was there all along." Carlos considered that. "Then maybe that story matters." "Maybe," Richard said, exhausted but awake in a way he hadn't been for years. Carlos stood. "I live at St. Catherine's Shelter on 43rd. If you feel like giving up, don't. Come find me." "You'd really do that?" "Someone should," Carlos shrugged. "Might as well be me." As the boy walked away into the darkness, Richard remained seated, heart aching, mind clear. A man who had lost everything and, for the first time, found a reason to stay. Richard didn't go back to his boarding house right away. He remained on the playground bench long after Carlos disappeared into the darkness, sitting in silence, replaying every word, every look, every moment. His hand still tingled where Carlos had held it, as if the warmth had soaked into his bones. It wasn't the touch itself that stayed with him. It was what it represented. Presence, choice, grace freely given. He'd come to the park prepared to barter for one last reminder that he was human before ending his life. One final transaction. Instead, he'd been confronted, stripped bare, and offered something he could never have earned. Honest connection paired with brutal accountability. Not pity. Not forgiveness. A challenge to live. The irony felt cruel and poetic at the same time. His entire life had been transactional. Every relationship evaluated for value. Every decision reduced to profit and loss. And the one thing that finally broke through his emotional armor was the one thing money could never buy. It had been given by a child who had every reason to withhold it. Around 2 in the morning, Richard finally stood and made his way back through the quiet streets. His body hurt. His heart condition, the emotional collapse, the sheer exhaustion of the last days. But beneath the pain was something unfamiliar. Not happiness. Not peace. Purpose. A fragile but undeniable reason to wake up tomorrow. His boarding house room was small and bleak. A narrow bed, a cracked mirror, a dresser with a drawer that wouldn't close. But it was warm, safe, private. For the first time, he truly noticed what that meant. How much he'd taken for granted when he'd lived in mansions guarded by gates and silence. He lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the stained ceiling, thinking about the days ahead. The days he'd planned not to live. They still felt heavy, but now they also felt possible. Useful. Necessary. The next morning, Richard woke with clarity he hadn't felt in over a year. He had 3 days before his disability check arrived. 3 days to prove, to himself most of all, that this wasn't just emotional release. That he meant it. He began to write. Not a farewell letter, but a confession. A map. He documented everything. Pricing meetings, internal language, the justifications executives used to sleep at night. He named names, drugs, numbers, patterns. He wrote until his hands shook, knowing every word burned the last bridges behind him. On the second day, he contacted a journalist who had covered his trial with unflinching precision. He sent the file with a single message. I was part of the problem. I want to tell the truth. The reply came fast. On the third day, Richard cashed his check, bought groceries, paid rent, and walked to St. Catherine's shelter carrying supplies and fear in equal measure. When Carlos appeared, surprised but smiling, something settled in Richard's chest. He had shown up. Meeting Rosa was harder. She looked at him not with rage, but with the kind of grief that comes from years of survival. When Richard told her the truth, fully without softening it, she didn't shout. She didn't forgive him. She simply asked whether he truly understood what he had destroyed. I'm beginning to, he said, and it was the most honest answer he had. He started volunteering that same day. Then the next, and the next, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, serving food. His hands blistered, his back ached, his heart struggled, but he stayed. Weeks later, the article dropped. The fallout was brutal. Lawsuits threatened. Old allies vanished. But Richard kept going. He testified. He spoke. He stood in front of rooms full of strangers and told the truth without defense. Some things changed. Not enough. Never enough. But something shifted. And through it all, he carried the memory of a playground at night. A small hand offered freely. Not redemption. Not forgiveness. Just a moment of humanity that changed the direction of a broken man's life. Richard Harmon was never the same again. Not healed. Not absolved. But awake. And for the first time, that was enough.